Things off. As I said earlier, my name is Chris Lloyd. I'm Oxford Computer Group's CTO. Today, I'm actually joined by Diana Volere, who's a Saviynt Principal Solutions Architect. We'll be kind of tag teaming this presentation where I'm going to go through my slides, and then she's going to actually give a demo with accompanied with some use cases for Saviynt Express. And that's kind of what our whole webinar here today is about. It's about enhancing your Microsoft identity platform with Saviynt Express, which is a new offering from Saviynt. And so I'm just going to give some background on Oxford Computer Group. We've been in the industry for 16 or more years at this point. We've done hundreds of enterprise projects, deployed a lot of seats to Office 365, and we've been Microsoft Partner of the Year for several years, and not always consecutively, but we do strive to get that award. We have deep connections within Microsoft, within their cloud engineering team, especially their identity team, and now we also have a strong connection to the Saviynt engineering team. And in fact, in 2018, we were Saviynt's Impact Partner of the Year. So to kick this off as a foundational layer to this webinar, I wanted to set the stage on some of the things we've seen during our engagements. Oxford has deployed MIM over 900 times in different customer environments, and these span different verticals. So whether it's healthcare, finance, or retail, we've really seen it all. And MIM Sync is still a very powerful tool, and we deploy it for handling synchronization. And there have been many organizations that have made a significant investment in MIM, in having it in their environment and performing all sorts of identity orchestration and identity provisioning tool sets. And we do deploy the MIM portal in a lot of those engagements, but it's often not used as a end user request system. And there's various different reasons to that, but out of the box, it handles group membership requests, which is typically less than adequate for meeting the needs of an access request process. The MIM portal is typically used for an event-based post-processing system. So we use the workflow engine a lot of times to do sorts of workflows, execute PowerShell scripts, and then to use it for its dynamic membership feature. And in a lot of different environments, reporting is really big. It has a big demand. We're answering those questions of who has access, how did they get it, and when the access was removed are the typical reports that we have to generate. These are sometimes hard reports to generate in MIM, and they also require the System Center Service Manager component to actually use the MIM reporting module. And lastly, our customers are actually looking to extend to the cloud. It's a large part of their initiative. And many organizations are looking to the cloud, to cloud-first solutions, and they're doing so with investments being made in Azure AD. And we're seeing more applications being integrated into Azure AD to use those security features that Microsoft has baked into that platform. They're essentially using Azure AD as that control plane to who gets access into those applications. So before I continue on to Saviynt Express and where does that fit into this picture, I wanted to flash up a quick diagram of the typical MIM customer. And in fairness, MIM could be replaced by another identity management product. So we could put NetIQ in there, or I'm sorry, Micro Focus. You'll have to forgive me. I have a bias or a foundational knowledge of NetIQ and Novell stuff, so I typically forget who actually owns that product at any given time. But today we're actually focusing on MIM, and so I'm just going to flash up MIM here, and we'll continue with MIM, but just keep in mind it could be replaced by any different product. MIM typically gets its identity source data or its authoritative source from a source of truth, usually the HR or HCM system. Can be multiple of those systems based upon mergers and acquisitions. And it typically provisions those to AD, Exchange, and various different other data repositories or applications, depending on how MIM is configured. I've also included Azure AD into this picture, which is connected through Azure AD Connect. It's very prevalent in most environments today. And you'll see that MIM is not directly connected to Azure AD, which means that on-premise Active Directory is the intermediary between MIM and Azure AD. Since more identity objects are starting to be in the cloud, such as groups, B2B guest users, MIM is really getting an incomplete picture of the total identity landscape at an organization. And so I've kind of framed that up with that we're losing control or visibility in the entire organization to kind of pivot into a Saviynt Express conversation. And so this slide here is really set to stage of where identity management, identity access management, and identity governance, where those different components fit. The first box is what most organizations have figured out, at least to the high value and large population of applications. The second box is where many of you want to get to or are starting to look at. These items in the second box have been going on in our organizations on spreadsheets with tribal knowledge passed from one person to the next. There's an immense value in bringing this into a structured, streamlined product with a framework for handling these tasks. However, that's really not enough, right? I mean, we're in 2019, and without the last box of identity analytics, we haven't really enhanced the process. We've just put it into a framework. Identity analytics allows us to give the items in that second box contextual information. This enables certifiers to make educated decisions versus just rubber stamping the requester's information for what they're doing, for whether or not it violates a policy in an organization. So the Saviynt platform, which is really what we're here to talk about through Saviynt Express, aligns with the Microsoft identity platform. Microsoft is targeting really the authentication and security side of the house, and Saviynt complements this with the administration and governance. We can even have Saviynt enrich some of those components that Microsoft has, like conditional access, and I'll look at that later on in the slides. And so here are some of the questions that Saviynt can help answer. Typically, they're categorized into these three different buckets. So we've got visibility, getting your identity and entitlement data into Saviynt allows it to be categorized and reported on. Governance with access reviews and segregation of duty rule sets. Security, aligning your security policies with the configuration of a Saviynt solution. And collectively, these boil down to identity governance and intelligence. So I typically set the stage in any technical presentation with a high-level diagram. So what I've done is I've taken the MIM implementation from before, and I've added Saviynt Express to it. I've also matured the organization by adding some SaaS applications and some more complex on-premise applications, which is why you see Epic and Oracle eBusiness Suite. Saviynt is a cloud-based solution, and we've built a bidirectional connector for MIM to transmit identity data and entitlements, which allows MIM to populate Saviynt with identity data and MIM to receive account and entitlement data from Saviynt. Saviynt is also connected to Azure AD and Office 365. This is how we get that complete view of the identity landscape. So we're basically taking Saviynt and making an extension of MIM, and then it's also able to correlate that information with SaaS-based applications with Azure Active Directory. So Saviynt can bring our access requests into play, and with its connection to MIM, we're able to utilize MIM applications. So the access requests in an organization are critical for enabling users to select new access, which is required for performing their job. So sometimes we do birthright access, where we give out access based upon who you are or just by nature of existing at the company, but there's always that additional level of access that needs to be added onto an account through a request process. The ultimate goal with Saviynt is to have that single portal where a user can go and request either an account or an entitlement that grants access into a system. And on the other side of that request is the approvals needed to grant that access. So depending on how many levels of approval or Maybe it doesn't require approval at all, but if we do need approval, we want to track that. And Saviynt actually goes a step further than the traditional request process that I just laid out. It allows, we can bring in the identity analytics into the request process. So we have a shopping cart experience that we can send the users through when they're requesting access. And then we can provide them recommendations. Those is what you see on the top of that screenshot there. We have recommended applications, and that's all based upon their peer groups. So the peer groups are usually defined by departments, positions. You get to define it in your organization. So it's a configuration item within Saviynt. Risk can also be a factor during the request process using Saviynt. If the request has a conflicting permission with a rule set that you've configured, so if you say you can have this access, but you can't have this, or if you do request this, which is something I want to present to the requester, it'll have a likelihood or a non-likelihood of getting approved. But if you put in the right business justification here, maybe the requester will grant it to you, and then we'll have to mark that as a mitigating control later on. When we take Saviynt Express and integrate it with MIM, Saviynt becomes the front-end tool that users request access with, and MIM becomes the fulfillment engine. Saviynt Express doesn't actually require MIM or any other identity management tool set, but if it's already in place, we can reduce the time to value by leveraging the existing plumbing and investment that was already made with MIM, meaning we can just take the connectors that MIM already has that were either developed or configured out of the box, and we can just leverage those rather than have to go through a complete rip and replace process. In this scenario, Saviynt can be used to have users request access to groups, applications, or use the Saviynt portal to actually onboard users not contained in any authoritative sources. So similar to some of the customizations that we would have done in a big MIM portal implementation, but we've got a much nicer interface and with many more features than we would have ever had in the MIM portal. And some of you may be saying this is all great, but we already have a portal for access requests through some ITSM tool like ServiceNow. And the introduction of another portal will create confusion within our user base. And in those instances, we can also connect Saviynt to ServiceNow, so that ServiceNow actually acts as the front-end request portal and transmits that request to Saviynt for approvals and other identity analytics operations. And I've never been, so for group cleanup here, I've never been to an organization where there wasn't a proliferation of groups. I've never been to a place that says, okay, we've got a control of all of our groups. Often these are resolved using the look the other way approach. If we don't see it, it's not a problem. So when we connect Saviynt Express to MIM or directly to Active Directory, if MIM isn't in the picture, we can push these groups into Saviynt or pull, depending. I was thinking of MIM, so MIM is a push operation, but if we're using just Saviynt with its Active Directory connector, it's a pull. And then once they're in Saviynt, those groups can be analyzed, and Saviynt can propose owners for those groups. Again, we're using the identity analytics information to do that. And the same principle applies to Azure AD groups. So in that same, we're not only connecting to Active Directory on-premise, but we're connecting to Azure because we're starting to see many more groups be cloud-only groups. And in fact, if you've recently started a Microsoft Teams rollout or are thinking about Teams, the number of groups that you will have will grow exponentially. And so since Saviynt connects to both directories, it can identify orphan groups and propose owners, or look at groups with no members and recommend potential action of deletion. So the provision to non-Microsoft enabled applications is always one of the questions we get asked by our MIM customers. And a lot of times it will involve us writing a connector for MIM. So it's a separate code base. It's not provided by Microsoft. They did provide a framework for us to build those connectors. The out-of-box connector set for MIM is relatively short. And as I said, there's a reliance on that custom code to build your own connectors. Azure AD also has connectors for SCIM connectors, is what they're known as, which stands for System for Cross-Domain Identity Management. That list is also short, and they're primarily focused on SaaS-based applications. That list is continuously growing, but Saviynt has an extensive list of connectors that are configured rather than coded. So Saviynt, which is it's essentially a service that you're procuring, is in much the same way as Azure AD. They built connectors and they continually write new ones and update their existing ones, and they connect to complicated systems like an Epic, which is an EHR or an electronic health record application, or Oracle e-business suite. Additionally, new applications that you onboard in the future should be connected in this manner, right? So we had MIM, but MIM's not going to have an Epic connector or an Oracle e-business suite connector that can do all the fine-grained entitlement items that Saviynt can do. And so basically you're allowing yourself to pivot in a slow, methodical manner over into a new platform as MIM is deprecated in the future. Another item that MIM falls short on is access certifications. And it's one of the reasons that Oxford Computer Group, when we were looking for a governance platform, we went searching for one and we came across Saviynt. We evaluated all sorts of different products, but we really liked the way that Saviynt did access certifications. They're a hard and fast requirement in many audits. And auditors will accept a manual process on Excel sheets in their evidence collection process. I know this to be true because my wife is an auditor. But running those manual processes take time and man hours. And those manual processes are often a snapshot in time. So whenever they were extracted last from that system. Once the entitlement data is extracted and put into that Excel file, it's already stale. So using Saviynt for attestation can reduce the effort needed to run that attestation. And the certifiers are always working on the current data because they're just going directly into the Saviynt platform to do their access certification. Manual access certifications also fail because they provide to give the certifier enough contextual data to make an informed decision during the review. So with Saviynt Express, the certifier will be shown if an entitlement is not common amongst a user's peer group, or how the access was obtained, or if the access was granted via a birthright access, a role, or through the access request process. They'll even get information based upon how the last attestation, what the results of the last attestation were. Without this additional information, many manual access reviews are simply just a rubber stamping exercise. They're rather than an actual, a good security posture mechanism. So before we leave access certifications, I wanted to show off another concept that Saviynt Express brings to the table. And this is the concept of micro-certifications. Micro-certifications can be spawned by events that occur during the life cycle of an identity. As an example, if I change positions or get a new manager, my access should be evaluated by my superior. So during this change in position, I may have been granted new access based on a role or a rule, but during a transition phase, it's often the case that the user transitioning is still doing work related to the old role. So when my manager gets my micro certification, which was triggered by my job code change, they have the option to conditionally certify any access that I may need for a period of time during the transition. So when the manager goes in there, they click the conditional certify button, they pick an end date for that access, and my access is retained until that end date is hit. And lastly, I'm going to walk through a couple steps here about how closely aligned or how much we can enhance an Azure Active Directory scenario with Saviynt. So Azure AD has conditional access, and we've deployed it extensively to our customers. This is a very highly used feature set of Azure AD. Azure AD is able to basically evaluate a user as they're signing into an application to either allow them to access the application, enforce multi-factor authentication based upon certain condition sets, or block access entirely. And it does this based upon the various sensors that it has and that it's leveraging. So user attributes are from Azure AD, devices are either from Intune or actually joined to Azure AD, applications, depending on the application and its capabilities, you can have session controls within that. Locations are defined by IP address ranges, and then the risk is from a Azure Active Directory identity protection, where Microsoft's evaluating the risk of where you're signing in from, whether or not you're going through anonymous proxies, and a wide variety of other different sensors that they've deployed. So what if we could enhance this platform to include entitlement risks or segregation of duty risks, right? So we have Saviynt, we know it's going to track risk items for us within entitlements or segregation of duties. And so we can actually plug that in. And I just want to run through a quick use case of how that would work within conditional access. And so this is going to be a quick walkthrough. This first part is where we don't have Saviynt and kind of how the conditional access would work. So Tom Smith has a device that's Azure AD joined, or it's enrolled with Intune. He has a Salesforce account that has a standard profile platform user. It's a basic profile with no elevated permissions, and Salesforce is configured with Azure AD as an identity provider, so single sign-on from Azure AD. Tom Smith goes and does his authentication to Azure AD. The conditional access policy is evaluated at that point. He passes, devices enrolled in Intune. There's no other, nothing else that needs to be evaluated, and he's granted access. So if we bring Saviynt into the picture with this configuration, we have a connector to Salesforce, from Saviynt to Salesforce. That's either we could use it for provisioning, we could use it for a read-only. In this case, it's only important for us to know that we read it. We're going to read the entitlements back in. And with Saviynt, I'm using a very general provisioning or a entitlement structure within Salesforce. Saviynt has the ability to go very fine-grained on all sorts of applications, including Salesforce. But for this purposes, I'm just looking at the Salesforce profile, which is essentially a role in Salesforce. But Saviynt's reading that information back in, and we're reading the accounts, the permissions, and we can basically tell Saviynt, hey, this system administrator permission within Salesforce is a risky permission. And we can configure Saviynt to go populate a group in Azure Active Directory once a profile changes in Salesforce to say, okay, this needs to be added into a group in Azure Active Directory. That group is now also configured in the conditional access policy of Azure to require MFA. So when the user goes and authenticates, they'll get an MFA challenge. Now you could easily rig this up yourself, but keeping the data constantly refreshed based upon what happens in Salesforce or any other application would be a very time-consuming and a very non-automated process. And so the access is granted to Salesforce once the user passes their MFA challenge. So that kind of ends my section of the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Diana.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that. Let's see if I can get myself up here as the presenter. And there we go. So I really appreciate what Chris has said today, walking through what Saviynt is and how it complements things. And what I want to do with Saviynt Express is literally show you a Saviynt environment where we have implemented a connection to on-premises AD, Azure, Office 365, SharePoint, etc., and walk through how users interact with this environment and what their experience and use cases are like now. And so I was going to frame this from these four personas for the conversation. We have Edward, who's a new employee, Margaret, who's his manager, Allison, who is the on-premises owner of Active Directory, and Cathy, who's in charge of compliance. So as we go through showing the actual user experience, these are the ones we're going to be talking about. And we're going to start with Edward. So as with most new employees, and I'm sure this is something you experience, a new employee wants to be productive quickly, and they want to sometimes request access to everything under the sun because they don't want barriers to productivity. So when they're trying to get access to something, they'll say, make me like this person in the other department who might have expansive and extensive access more than what they need. So what activities Edward really needs to do are just, see what access he has out there, request applications, and experience some of that suggestion of, here's the access you probably should have. So I was going to run over here then, literally. We have, as I said, we're going to run to the Saviynt Express front end here. It is single sign-on through Microsoft. And let's go log in as Edward. So what you're seeing as we log in here, this is the Saviynt dashboard. It's not highly customized. You're not seeing a lot of company logos or colors here, but this is the basic interface where Edward can go to request access. If you look around, you'll notice that he does not have a lot of access or a lot of things that are available to him right now. He only has one tab available, the Access Request System, and he only has a few panels to him, things like changing passwords, etc. So let's go and look at what sort of access Edward has right now. I come on board. If I was a manager, I could change and look at other users, but I can see these are systems that I have access to. Oh, I have something at Azure. Okay, at Azure AD, I have an Edward employee account there. I have Office 365, and I have an account there. I have Active Directory. I have a subscription to Azure. So MIM here, we have actually defined MIM as an application individually within Azure, and different applications MIM is perhaps granting access to are entitlements within it, or groups within Active Directory that membership is in. But you'll notice these aren't defined under Active Directory as groups. I have a different thing that I'm a member of there. No, they're tied to MIM as an application so that you can have groups that are relevant access somebody gets tied to the application that they're provisioned from. So you know that he should have access to RackF, to OneDrive, to a couple of other applications there. And this is where you could glance and see what's out there right now. When he wants to go and actually request access, keeping in mind what we just saw, I want to go back here and I want to make an access request to get something new. So he has all these accounts already. That's why it's modify, not add account. And MIM is kind of an interesting one. So I want to go and modify access to MIM. Yeah, let's go do that. I could modify to a couple of other things, but this becomes a shopping cart example. I've picked out what I want to change. And when I go to actually look at what I can do with the MIM, I'll see these other groups that are applications. Now, I may not know, as we've noted, what I want access to. Saviynt provides JRM, which stands for Job Role Mining. These are recommendations that have been created. Saviynt has created them based upon what similar access is out there. Chris was talking about that. We can look across peer groups, see what access other people have in a similar role, and say, okay, those are recommendations. So here I can look, hey, here's some recommendations within this environment. I want to maybe add SQL Server and SharePoint as two things because they're recommended. Now, if I'm the new employee and I want to add everything under the sun, I could also try and add Hyperion and Dropbox, right? So then I have a long list of things I want to add, and I go to next in my shopping cart. And here is where you get that experience where, hey, some of these we're pretty confident are going to be approved. You have this instant analysis of the probability that you actually need this access. This is approval confident, it matches our rule, and you'll notice that the business justification is not even required for these because they're so common. And as an organization, you could set it up so that not only is the business justification not required, but you may just choose to automatically approve things that are very common access requests within an organization and just keep it for certification and auditing purposes. But just say that a manager shouldn't have to go through and say, yes, this person needs SharePoint access. That may just become a common thing. Now let's contrast that with when I'm asking to add things that are not common to people across either my department or maybe they're just high risk altogether. Maybe you have identified applications that are high risk altogether and they have a low approval confidence. You'll notice that a business justification is required in that case. I have to try and explain why is it I want this again if it's something that's a little bit unique. So even as an employee, I can start with examining and understanding my organization's risk and try to be responsible about what I'm doing. And by the way, in this access request system, I can put in comments about why I want this. I could have attachments. I mean, if you had some certification that had to happen first, and I had to prove it, you could actually attach that here and then go ahead and click submit. And that's how you go through the process of requesting access to go to your manager. Pretty simple for Edward. Now, after Edward, we actually have his manager, Margaret, who has a kind of different set of concerns. Margaret's, like many business managers, not really interested in what technology is being used. Margaret just wants to be able to be productive and to be able to not be a barrier to her employees having what they need. Now, there's some challenges with this as we start talking about identity governance. Identity management, Chris was talking about this, just the provisioning, deprovisioning, joiner, mover, and leaver is very much about just automation of getting access, but governance is also around that risk of access and understanding what's going on with that. And so Margaret may be good at just granting somebody access to things, but often Margaret or managers don't feel like they know what is risky that I'm giving somebody access to. I can review access, I can fulfill access requests for employees, but why is this going on? What do I look at in certification campaigns, because you have to do them, to see if that's risky for a user? And how do I become part of this process of knowing what access my employee has and if it's really reasonable? So we want to talk about how that works for Margaret. We're going to go back here and log in as her. Margaret Manager, she too has the same wonderful benefit of coming into her Microsoft account. Now, you'll note when we look at Margaret over here that one of the first things you'll see is she has many more capabilities than we saw for Edward. She has more panels here. She has another tab for attestation, for example. She has more things she can do. So one of the first things under what we said she might need to do is she could go and set up delegates to do her approvals for her. Right? She's approving access, but if she's on vacation, you don't want to have anything that's an access request drop into a black hole. So she can actually set up people who she prefers to delegate access to. Or if you have a situation where somebody went on vacation and forgot to do that, you can have an administrator actually go in and set that up. She could request access for others. As a manager, she may need to go and do that. And she can actually go and say, hey, what is the request access history? What has been requested by people, and have her whole dashboard of what's going on, who's requested something to be granted, something to be revoked. She can see what's going on in her environment and then see what requests she's supposed to approve. Now you'll note when she looks at requests, she can see who it's for, who it was requested by, that she is the person that's been assigned to. She can see that it came in from the user interface as opposed to from an API. If it was coming in, for example, from your IT service management dashboard, from ServiceNow or something, we could actually see that here. And then she can look at, okay, what are the details around a request? Now you'll remember earlier you could see as Edward whether something was likely to be approved or not. We can see from her perspective, is this request something that's risky that I need to pay a lot of attention to or not? And because it is, I actually have a lot of information right here available on this screen to help me understand more. So the access that's enabled, if I go and look at the information, there are things that you can do to enrich in particular groups or roles. For example, this is a group within Active Directory that they're requesting to be a member of. And you can go through and actually import information or enrich it yourself about what is this group actually meaning. You can identify if it's system critical, and that's something you should watch for. Or if it's SOX critical, if this is something that I need to actually be auditing in particular for SOX reports, and I can actually detail more about the risk tied to it in particular. So as an administrator or as a manager, I don't have quite this sort of black box of what am I clicking yes to, and should I just click yes to everything? Maybe I can see, possibly not on this case. I can see where it came from. I can add my comments to it. There are even ways I can forward this on if I want somebody else to deal with it other than me, for example, if I don't feel like I have enough information to do so. And so there she is, delegating, looking at access requests. I also mentioned certification campaigns, the dreaded certification campaign. Now, there's a truth that we often see managers need to, as Chris was saying, whether it's manual or on paper or automatically, every few months go through and talk about what access somebody has. And we get a lot of rubber stamping because it's hard to understand what access does somebody need, where did they get it, is it important? So what we've done is actually taken these campaigns and made it, first of all, pretty easy to get a lot of information, as we say again, on the initial campaign page. This is all around the access, I'm going to scroll to the side here, for a particular employee, Edward employee, and access that he has. Now, there's a lot on the page, as I noted, but you can customize this so you're not overwhelmed with things. We have not identified criticality for entitlements, so I can pull that off. We've not distinguished between endpoints and systems, so I can pull that off. None of these are segregation of duty risks. I can make that campaign going. Now, here's an interesting one, last used. If you want to import usage data from logs into Saviynt, you can also have the ability to see, as Chris was saying, has this been used recently? Do they need this account even? So you can actually help control licensing and account access if you start integrating that in with this. So once you pull out a few other details, I can put this all on one screen, or mostly on one screen, then you can see for Edward employee, I'm looking across at his base account, and when was this last certified? I can see when somebody went through and approved this before already. If something was granted through a request, I can literally click and see what were the details of that request where somebody was granted access. So if I'm going to go through and I have to put my signature on this, that this is importantly approved, I can see where it came from, why that's the case, and easily sort and see, is this something that's unusual? Now, we've left Edward as a very suspicious person, you could say, but this is where you would be able to sort by outlier analysis and find all of the ones that are red, and those you'd probably want to look at individually. Whereas you could say, I'm going to just click on everything that's not as risky and do a math action for that of approving them. So this is really designed to help a manager going through that certification with more insight in what they're doing along the way and be able to look at across apps from Microsoft and beyond. So let's start looking at the next person on the list, the actual owner of AD. So Allison, who we consider the owner of Active Directory, has a number of different things that she's doing. She's managing groups, she's dealing with nested groups, she's dealing with application access groups, not just a group that gives you an application, but a group that may grant you entitlements within an application. And she needs to make sure, as she's doing this, that things are simple and understandable. She needs to do some rationalization, and she needs to guarantee that there's a certain somebody is always responsible for who's a member of a group. So her experience is going to be a little different again than what we've already seen from Margaret. When I sign in as Allison, you'll notice that I have a number of different panels here about things that I can do. Allison has the ability to do things like look at the enterprise roles or entitlements and dealing with other endpoints, adding new directories if she needed to. And one of the things that we see as a key function of this is this ability to, I call it create new role here, you could rename that to create new group, is the ability to create Active Directory groups in a governed fashion. Like as opposed to just going into users and computers and clicking and creating a group somewhere, that has very little that you have to put in place to create a group and almost no tracking available, no auditing. So what we want to do is bring groups into a much more enriched and knowledgeable environment so that I can enforce ownership, auditability, give a manager those things to know whether or not they should approve it. So as we go in here, I can say, does this group need to be approved? Who's going to approve it? How are they going to approve it? Does it need to be certified? Maybe once in a while it needs to be certified. What group, category am I going to put it in? I can put it in a description. I can tag it so somebody searching can find it more easily. and it's different than doing it in the Microsoft interface, yes, but it enables you, as I said, to have that full governance view of it. I could actually tie it to an application. They say App 1 and App 2, but I could say if this group is tied to MIM, I could have MIM here and say that this is going to be a group only tied to MIM and seen in that hierarchy. I could pick whether I wanted to go to all environments, to prod or non-prod. I have the ability to add a bunch of different information around that isn't available when I'm just creating a group straight up in Active Directory. I can even put requirements around it like, hey, this group, before somebody can be a part of it, they have to have some certifications or a background check or these natural double check processes within that access request process. So somebody can't just get in a group until they have fulfilled some of these additional requirements. So that's where we see some of the strong value in bringing this enrichment into Active Directory groups. Now, let's talk about the administrative side of things, where we discussed how we help with nested groups. And that's because everything that's a group we perceive as an entitlement. And this is a flat hierarchy. It goes on for pages and pages of these are groups where it's a member of different entitlements that have been brought in. We've imported from Active Directory into this. And then you have, once you've done so, an easy way I can look at one of these and see what are the child entitlements to this, quote unquote child entitlements, which is the same thing as nested groups. And I can start scrolling through that hierarchy, for example, and look at the next one down. What are the child entitlements to this one? What if I want to look, are the parent entitlements, everybody who is a group that this is nested beneath? So you have a very fast browser way to start seeing what are these entitlements, who's going to be the owner, showing that we have an ownership of in a bit, and where they're actually fitting in the hierarchy. Now, how this works on a user, if I want to be looking at some individual's access, is I can literally go into our Edward employee, see that he's a member of that one Active Directory group, as you recall, and that Active Directory group is a member of a number of other groups. So I can view this in that hierarchical fashion if I need to maintain what I'm doing around where I'm granting access, where it's coming from. But I also have this flattened view of it in the same way. So as you're trying to go through sorting things out, this is one of the ways that we start helping with that nesting process to have visibility in it and see what you're actually looking at in that hierarchy. And the other thing they wanted to discuss in this real fast is Allison ADOwner was she can actually look at data owners. She's literally the entitlement owner and can attest to the fact that she is the person who owns this, look at the person who's actually owning this group, see what's going on with it, approve, reject. She could nominate somebody else to be the owner of it as opposed to herself. So this is just one of those ways, if I know that I have been nominated as the owner of a group, but it's not realistic, I can actually go through and say, no, this isn't me. I shouldn't be doing this. I can go through decommissioning a group, which is slightly different than just deleting it. It goes through a governed process, so I can see when it ceased to be valid in my environment. And you can kick off these reviews to entitlement owners to make sure, hey, are you really still the person who should be approving group access to this group at any given time? So there's a little bit more that we're going to want to talk about orphan groups, et cetera. And some of that's going to fall underneath the venue of this last person we want to talk about, which is Cathy Compliance. Right? Now, Cathy Compliance has a totally different perspective than most of the other people there. And we don't often talk, when you usually talk about Microsoft Active Directory or Azure or O365, we don't talk as much about the compliance side as the tool is not embedded in it as deeply. This is where Saviynt comes alongside and helps this compliance officer who reports to the CISO about where there's risk in an organization. A compliance officer has to be able to see real-time, like dashboard level, what's going on, where are things falling apart, where are there segregations or separations of duty that somebody has access to poisonous entitlements to at the same time, toxic entitlements. Where are the campaigns where a manager is actually saying somebody needs to have this access and has been granted it? And how am I driving these out to the people who should be asking for them or fulfilling them? Really, Cathy has to be aware of the security posture of the organization at any given moment. So when I'm going to go look at Cathy's situation, you can see that she has pretty significantly different things that she'll see in the dashboard than everybody else, but things that fulfill organizational need. This page, okay, kind of all the same, but she has a new tab, SOD. So segregation of duty management. She can see at any given time who has access to two things that have been identified in the organization as what we would call segregation of duties. Nobody should have access to both of them at the same time. And if anybody's not familiar with it, the classic example is you shouldn't have somebody in accounts payable and accounts receivable who can actually create a PO for somebody, or create a PO and pay a PO. They could fictionally create a purchase order and then pay it themselves. That's a little bit outside of what somebody should be doing. It's a segregation of duty. You can identify those two different types of entitlement or access that somebody shouldn't have at the same time. So that's what Cathy needs to be able to look at. And we have a straight-up dashboard here for SOD violations where I can say, okay, somebody shouldn't be in the HR group and the finance group, but somebody is. I can look at what happened with this. They're in both of them. If there's more information available, it'll be here. And then I can choose, as Cathy, do I think that this is actually terrible? And I can choose to remediate it and kill that access right now because it's not safe. Or I can add a mitigating control. Chris was talking about micro-certifications. I can add a control that says, this, I believe, is okay for this short time. You know, maybe somebody's filling in another department temporarily. So I'm going to let this go for another 2 weeks. But at that point, I want to kick off a micro-certification that says, hey, should this person have all this access, for example? I can just continue to monitor it on here, or even just look at what the control was that this originally came from that caused this alert. So this is the sort of thing that the compliance manager is going to care about in terms of that segregation of duty. Now, before I get towards the analytics, let's go over and look at the attestation campaigns. She is the one who has to kick off these campaigns. So she can look at what's going on with the status of anyone that's out there. Like she has the manager campaign that's out there and see who is responding to it. Like there's Margaret, where she's responding to her employee. She's started. Here's people who haven't started. Here's somebody else who actually has started their campaign. I can see that this is an example of an outlier analysis where they can see, oh, hey, some of this is easily approved. Some of this is more suspicious. But as the compliance officer, I can go in and look at all these campaigns, see if somebody's not attending to it, and actually elevate that to a more critical status. Hey, you haven't fulfilled your campaign. I really need you to do this now, or we're going to start having problems. So both of those are aspects, the segregation of duty and certification campaigns that fall on their shoulders, and those are more process that go on and on. But let's talk about the analytics side of things. At any given time, Cathy needs to know what are risks in the environment. And I've pulled out, for example, orphan AD groups. She can actually run a report, pull out what are the orphaned AD groups in the environment that don't have owners, get a look at them. You know, and if you wanted to configure this, all that we have configured so far is that she can accept that risk, she can revoke that group, make it inactive, she can insist further review, but you can actually put in here the control to have it, you know, find particular people who would be a likely owner, suggest an owner, etc., all directly from the page where we're looking at the orphan groups. Now, the other thing, you know, that's an example of the report you can run and the actions you can take to see things, but there's also very much a real-time view of the environment where you can see very clearly highlighted where are risks, where are problems that I need to look at. And this is across applications. So we're just seeing this mainly focused on Microsoft. You could pull in other applications in here. You could pull in other environments. And this enables her your compliance officer to have that view of where is something that should be a concern. Document libraries with unique permissions. So I could drill into that. Office 365 inactive accounts, where I have sensitive files out there, my groups in Azure, for example. All of this is set up in a dashboard format because the compliance officer needs to see where that risk is at any given point. And then we also have for it the ability to look at users. Who are your most active users? What are the most active applications tied to it? Because these are the things that help you find where is the risk in my organization, right? So this is really about giving Cathy Compliance that instant real-time view to where risk is, so that when the CISO turns around and says, what's going on in my environment, she has an immediate answer. And that's where we see that sort of single pane of glass across Office 365, Azure, Active Directory, other applications. Having that single pane of glass really helps enable that secure entitlement or that secure compliance response in the environment. Now, there's one other thing I wanted to show you, and I know we're getting close on time, so I will do this quickly. If you will be patient with me for just one more minute. We talked about ensuring that a group always has group ownership being very important. And there's this discipline called succession management, which is making sure if a group owner leaves, that somebody else is automatically given ownership of that group, right? Because sometimes somebody creates a group or is the owner of a group, the approver of it is kind of critical in the environment. They happen to leave, and it sort of filters off into nobody is keeping an eye on it anymore, right? So without getting into too much details here, we have the ability to actually go through, find or set up in your environment rules so that say, if somebody actually has their status updating and they're leaving, then I'm going to go through, find all the groups they have, and transfer ownership of whoever they have that group membership of. Now, there's a couple of different ways I can define that. You could say if somebody leaves, it's always going to be their manager. But you can also, for an individual group, set up different what you would call levels of who might be responsible for what. Somebody might be responsible for approving a group. Somebody might be responsible for certifying a group. So if I wanted to go and actually examine a group, what do I call it? 74. I can't type and talk at the same time sometimes. Does everybody else have that? So if I wanted to go and look at the ownership of a group, I can see that I have the ability to give a ranking to a particular owner. So I can have somebody who is the rank 1, that would be, as we said, the approver. Rank 4 would be the certifier, and have each of these have a different succession management tied to it. We just call these generically ranked, but you can actually match that to whatever your business process is for group ownership and management, so that someone will always be owning the group and responsible for it, even if they roll out the door. So that is your real fast 25-minute dive into the understanding what the dashboard and the actual functionality with Saviynt Express looks like. And thank you so much for your attention on that. And I think what we want to do now in our last 5 minutes, Chris and I, is to throw it open if there's any Q&A out there.
And I do have, while everybody's still here, I do have one poll just to throw up to ask if you're interested in hearing more about Saviynt Express and MIM. And so we'd love to give you a demo, tailored to the use cases that you want to talk about, in your environment. And so we'd love to reach out and hopefully this will spark a conversation in your organization. All right. I think I've got some good responses back from that. But that is all we've got. Thank you for attending. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Really appreciate your time, everyone.